Okay, can you see that? Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so, well, I'd just like to thank the organisers and Abby really for inviting me to do this short talk. It's an honour, and I think this is such an important subject to cover. I think it's really important that artist teachers that work with adult learners need to be recognised. And I do believe that making these connections with each other will make everybody feel stronger. We're stronger together. I'm head of research at Leeds Arts University. I'm just trying to, there we go. But this is a collage of activity that I've done in the past. So I've got a background. One of my first teaching jobs was a watercolour class with older students. But I've also worked with community groups, making banners. I've done short-term projects, creating textiles with different people from different backgrounds. I've also worked in prison education, something I'm really passionate about. Again, people working in adult and community education can work with a large variety of different people in different contexts, different backgrounds. I've also spent a lot of time being very interested in access education, access to further study, access to careers in art and design, but also access to higher education. And I think what isn't always acknowledged is the role that teacher artists play in adult and community education in inspiring people to further, their educational journeys. So what I hope to cover in the next 30 minutes is to think about why I believe adult arts education is important, but also to think about what artist teachers and their students, I'm calling them here artist students, what do they share? What values do they share? I'm going to look at some examples of students that become educators. And I suppose a theme of this presentation is how do we have newcomers, which I've been met about people having new careers. How do we support them to become old timers? By that, I mean people with expertise and confidence working in this field. And then I'm going to end with some challenging reflective questions about how we can use communities of practice to develop people in adult and community learning. I just want to briefly start with this amazing manifesto from NCEA, and just the first sentence on this wonderful poster, which I think is absolutely fabulous. All learners, regardless of age, nationality or background, should have entitlement and access to visual arts education. And it might seem sometimes that some of the educational policies and discourses that we hear, do rightly so focus on young people, but we must always remember that through no fault of their own, some people later in life, for a myriad of reasons, need to access visual arts education. So why do I think adult learning in the arts is important? What I'm not going to do is to talk about routes to careers and increased salaries and that kind of line of argument as to why any form of adult learning is important. I think those arguments are well rehearsed. What I want to focus on in the idea of democratic education. So Basil Bernstein promoted or defined what for him was a democratic education. And it's the belief that everybody has the right to the education. And he broke it down into three aspects. Enhancement. So this is where people are the best that they can be. Their education enhances their well-being, their compassion, as well as their knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it gives people a space to think about themselves and their futures, their aspirations, you know, seeing what potential that they have in themselves and where they want to travel and go to. Secondly, inclusion is an important part of a democratic education. You know, this fits in with NCEA's manifesto that arts education should be for everybody who wants it. And then finally, participation, being active, being an active learner, but also being thinking about your education on a political level, thinking about citizenship, altruism, the ethics of care, the way that people can engage with their local communities. Education doesn't sit just with individuals. It's like a ripple in a pond, and it affects, you know, local communities, society in general. The great thing about adult learning as well is that I think it gives an opportunity for learning to be intergenerational. The richness of people sharing their cultural references from different eras, having a classroom or a studio where somebody from 18 is talking to somebody in their 50s or in their 60s about music, about art, about films, about ideas. It's incredibly rich to have that diversity of adults in a learning context. And then finally, Williams says that participation in particular is central to a socialist and democratic society. So adult learning in the arts encourages people to be active, to think about their own position on things, to have the confidence to develop a voice. So I've looked at two perspectives of research that's been undertaken in relation to adult learning in the arts. First of all, Abby's work, which is exploring this idea of becoming an artist teacher in adult and community learning, thinking about how people learn and how people's identity flourishes in these contexts. So that's very much from the point of view of the teacher. And then my work has kind of looked at the same field, but from the point of view of the student experience. So I'm interested in, you know, how education can promote the values I talked about, this idea of a democratic education, for example, but also what happens to these people after they've had their education, what influence they have on other people. And looking at these two bodies of research, I did find two commonalities that I just want to explore in this presentation. And I kind of want to argue that there are a lot of shared values and experiences between artist teachers and artist students. And two words seem to come out of these two bodies of research. That was the idea of altruism and the second one of community. So those are the ideas that I'm just going to look at in a little bit more detail. So altruism and students, there has been a lot of research looking at the motives of adult or mature students that want to study, that want to return to study. There's been a body of work, particularly in regards to the medical education and altruism, people wanting to help, wanting to be nurses, midwives, even doctors. However, I would argue that people study the arts, and that altruism, that idea of using the arts to help their local communities, to help their families, is still true. And I'm not saying that people are altruistic all the time. People's motivations change depending on their circumstances. For example, Scott, Burns and Cooney say that people are more likely to be altruistic when their own family needs and material needs are met. But I still argue that a lot of students are driven by the desire to give something back to society. Also, there's examples of people wanting to get, after their education, getting involved in community work or being politically aware, or taking that confidence and using it outside the educational context. Researchers O'Shea and Stone, for example, have argued that enabling courses, which are courses we would call access courses, can lead to more active and political citizenship. Southern has expressed a skeptical notion of altruism, saying that really, you know, artists, when they're working and creating, you know, is that a self-indulgence when there are people suffering or there are people hungry in the world? But I would argue that that comes from an understanding of creativity as an individualistic artistic practice. Friedman in 2015 really advocates the idea that learning in the arts should be concerned with participation and collaboration. And we need to move away from this idea of the self-interested personal practice. So, I mean, what do I mean when I talk about altruism? A philosopher that I greatly admired, Martha Nussbaum, has thought a lot about altruism. And she breaks it down into 3 types. And basically, altruism that's practiced by entrepreneurs, people who do seek wealth and influence, but as a byproduct, end up creating things that do have social benefits. She then goes on to talk about philanthropists who are interested in doing good for the good of others. However, she argues that they do this still for some form of personal gain. And that might be to do with being seen to be a good person or being seen to do good. And that gives the person some kind of personal satisfaction. The benefit is there, but there's also a benefit for the person doing that good act. Thirdly, she talks about selfless altruism. And this is where people recognize that certain things need to be done. Good acts need to be done. People are in need, and we need to act to make sure that nobody suffers, to support people. But what Nussbaum says, that this is different to the other 2 forms of altruism because it's done as a way of being. It's a mundane part of life. It's not a special behavior. It's something that you do, and you would do it no matter what. Selfless altruism, Nussbaum goes on to talk about 2 forms of selfless altruism, where a good deed is done because it will contribute towards the flourishing of human life, and the person is aware, and it's about that person's good conduct. And then secondly, another form of altruism is recognizing that a good deed needs to be done, but it doesn't matter who does it. It's not about an individual's personal conduct. This is about getting something done that needs to be done. So Nussbaum recognizes that these models that she's promoted can seem very rational and individualistic and very stable and constant. But what she says is humans are very complicated, and probably altruism is a combination of all these things at different times. But what's important is that people do continue to carry out altruistic acts. So I want to go on to explore this idea that I have that some adult students start off as students and then become newcomers into teaching themselves. It becomes like a cycle. And very often, because they've recognized the value that their artist teachers in adult and community learning have given them, that inspires them to spread the word, to recognize that everybody should have this experience. And I just want to explore whether, you know, this is an altruistic act. Is it a motivator? So one example is a wonderful art school, Ilkley Art School, that was set up as a informal art school. It's not accredited. It's not about passing exams. It's about the organisers getting together and putting on courses for the joy of learning. But also not just for a particular age range. They work with all age ranges, and they're really experimental and trying to get people passionate about their art practice. And a quote from them is that, "My sense is that the arts in schools is at an all-time low, but there is a sea change. There is a sea change. Access and undergraduate study needs to be defended, the only available route for many at the moment." I think what they're saying there is that some people are dissuaded from studying the arts at school, which is a real shame, and that, you know, for lots of different reasons. So going forward, we need the opportunities for people to be able to study the arts later on in life. The next example is Eliza, and she gave up 3 months of her job to go to a place in Italy, Rovereto, in Trentino, where she set up sewing groups for refugees and immigrants. This woman has fantastic dressmaking skills, but she also is very good at getting people to tell their stories. She in herself is a very good storyteller. And she went there and listened to people while they were sewing and making, and got them to tell their stories and think about their stories and what they wanted to do in the future and what they wanted to happen. You know, so this is, I would argue, a very altruistic thing to do. And basically, these are like 2 examples of artistic projects that are about giving people an opportunity to study the arts. And finally, the Arts Collective, a group of people getting together, sharing arts practices. And one of them has said, "Through the arts trail, I have worked with other people. I have given some of them confidence, broken down barriers and fears. If I can do it, you can do it." And again, isn't that a wonderful message? You know, saying I've had this experience, I've succeeded, and I want you to do the same. So I'm just exploring it, you know, that perhaps there are some shared values. So for instance, I want to argue that altruism and the belief and the value of an arts education and a belief in a democratic education could be some of the values that we share. And how, as a community, you know, being part of a community is about having shared values. Interestingly, Diane Ray said in 2003 that in her research, she found it very difficult to disentangle the students' values and attitudes towards community and cooperation from that of their tutors. And that suggested that non-traditional students undertaking an access course place value on community and cooperation rather than more individualistic approaches to decision making. So this belief that students become more interested, perhaps, in social and political interests through education is explored by West et al. And this kind of engagement leads to greater altruism, social liberalism, and life satisfaction. Interestingly, Thomas and Malloy in their research, which is aimed at a different age range, but still sees this connection between civics and citizenship. When studying, strong art and design courses, they develop social awareness. And I love this phrase, it orientates people to be awake to the world, to realize that you are part of a bigger structure. And that bigger structure is there to be explored, and, connecting with people, but also connecting with the non-human world. So how do people from adult and community learning develop into communities and have shared values? But what are also the barriers against that happening? So unfortunately, I suppose there's a feeling that perhaps, how do people become artist teachers in adult and community learning? I suspect there's many routes to doing that kind of work. But when thinking about the community arts element of this, there's a feeling that community arts based programs are diminishing, there's less around. And yet these are the programs that are really important for developing just and sustainable societies, for creating a sense of well-being. However, these kind of courses have suffered from significant cuts. Louise in 2013 has said also that university-run community projects are part of a dying tradition. And then I found this quotation from the CEO of Creative People and Places, an Arts Council programme in 2017, really striking. In my view, there's nowhere in the UK that teaches socially engaged arts practice, which is bizarre because socially engaged practice is the fastest growing and most significant element of our art practices changing globally. And yet the UK education system is not responding to that. So I'm really talking about this educational context that is a challenge, if you want to get into this kind of work and learn the skills and to form an identity of being an artist educator in adult and community education. So I want to pursue and argue for the community as a practice and how important this conference is for trying to grow these networks, because they're important to support people, but also to grow and develop new comers into old timers. So the Wenger, I'm sure some of you might be very familiar with this, the Wenger communities of practice model, the domain, the practice, and the community. What could a community of practice look like for artist teachers? A domain is of knowledge, creates common ground, inspires members to participate, guides their learning, and gives them meaning to their actions. So as a group of people, what common areas of interest do we share? Community, the notion of a community creates the social fabric for that learning. A strong community fosters interactions and encourages a willingness to share ideas. How can we connect and create productive, sustainable relationships that allows that learning to take place? And then finally, practice. Whereas the domain provides the general area of interest for the community, the practice is the specific focus around which community develops, shares, and maintains its core knowledge. What is our core knowledge for artist teachers, and how can we develop it? So if we go back to this model, the domain, common areas of interest, the arts as a positive force in a democratic society, and the right for all to engage with the arts. So the practice, what can we learn and share for our practices about how we work with students and others respectfully, how we share our skills, how we encourage learning, and everybody being supported to have their own voice, how we encourage people to have confidence and belief in themselves. And I think that core knowledge is actually very valuable, and we shouldn't underestimate it. And then finally, community. We need to connect inside the community of practice and outside institutions. Sometimes institutions, somebody can be a part of an institution but still be isolated. You might be in a college situation or a prison situation, yet you might be the only one teaching art and design skills. So look for champions, champions such as NCAD or NCA. Look for, create new communities, exploit social media and new technologies, support others and share others' good practice, and develop students who want to become teachers in the field. So I think potentially communities of practice can overcome isolation. They can challenge this idea that there are no role models for good practice in the institution. It can alleviate that feeling of being invisible, of not having a voice, the frustration of people not understanding what you actually do, feeling that the work isn't valued, the learning isn't valued, the subject knowledge isn't valued, but most disturbingly, sometimes that the students aren't valued. A community of practice can support where there's no infrastructure that supports adult learning in the arts. Or sometimes it's frustrating and challenging when curricular and inspection models are designed for other subject areas and other sectors. How do we respond to those things? And having a community of practice can support us in that. How can we, as a community of practice, promote the benefits of adult learning in the arts? Because generally, I don't know if they're measured effectively. And how do how do newcomers become old timers? So if we look at this model from Lavey and Wenger, they argue that a newcomer becomes an old timer through full participation in a community, which allows situated learning, where they can learn through social practice, through engagement, interaction, collaboration, shared values, shared knowledge, learning skills, and importantly, constructing new knowledge. So this identifies learning as a contextual social phenomenon achieved through participation in a community of practice. So I'm just going to finally end and with these questions. If we do, how do we build these communities of practice of artist teachers who work, how do we build them that they are inclusive? I don't have any answers, but we need to think about how we can do that. And then we need to think, how do we have influence outside of that community of practice? Because we need to talk to people who are not aware of what we do. We need to promote policies and practices that enable us to continue our work, but also to spread the knowledge and skills that we have that would benefit all other parts of the educational process. And finally, how do we gain strength from altruism and compassion? These are not soft words. Altruism and compassion are rigorous words. And I think they're key to community and democratic education. So thank you for that. I hope that all made sense. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting to hear you talking about it and mentioning all the different sectors as well. So, artist teachers, adult community learning that are based in colleges and prison. We're all over the place. And I think that came through very strongly in your presentation and is also reflected in the presentations that we've got coming up by the participants later as well. I had one question that came in as you were talking. I think someone would just like a bit more information on Eliza, if you had any more.
Yeah. Okay, yes, I do. Eliza came to education late in life. It was the same story that I don't know, you all might have heard this story before, where they've never had an opportunity to study the arts. They've always had to have a career in a certain field. And then they get to a certain age and they think, this is the time for me to do something for me. So they went, they did some evening classes. I don't know if we still have evening classes in the UK at the moment, but evening classes were great because you could work and then you could study on an evening. And then that person went and did an access course, and then they went and got inspired and did a degree. It took them a long time. They had to do it part-time. And then they went on to do postgraduate study, and then they went on to do community arts work. So their whole journey is that their learning journey is so important. It all started really with adult and community education, and that's what's so inspiring and why this work's important.
Brilliant. So it's had someone post in the chat say at WEA they do a few evening classes still.
Great stuff. Brilliant.
Yeah. We have a few requests for your presentation, so I don't know if you're happy to share that with attendees. Obviously rich information. Also, this has been recorded as well, so if anyone wants to listen back, you'll be able to hear Sam talk and also look at the presentation at the same time, which is always brilliant. Tracy has asked a question: do you think that learning in the arts can build social capital, especially in socially deprived areas?
Yes, I think it can. I think it can if it's done carefully and by people who have the skills and sensitivities to do that. I'm thinking when I started as a community artist, there was a feeling that a community arts group, perhaps from a privileged background, would be helicoptered into a community, would spend, I don't know, a month in that community, do something, and then leave that community. So what I'm trying to say is the arts are important, but there needs to be relationships built, and it needs to be something that's long term, that's carefully thought about. And I'm a big advocate of trying to find practitioners from those local areas who have no local knowledge, you know, so that they can work with people.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question come in from Simon saying, is a barrier to creating a community across ACL the fact that it is structured across so many sectors,
Yeah,
local authorities and different regions?
Yeah, I think that is the different funding for the work. There's many pipelines to getting into this kind of work. It's very complicated. It almost needs somebody, perhaps this is another PhD, for somebody to map all the routes into adult and community work, but how then it's funded and how it's regulated and what bodies look after it. I suspect it's very complex. For instance, people who are working in prison will have another set of inspection and criteria that they have to meet in addition to the learning part of the work. So yeah, I think that's very true. So we need to think, I suppose we need to think creatively of how we create a community of practice. And as I've said, try and make use of the tools that we have now to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Penny asks if you can suggest any future professional development for this community.
Ooh, I did try and do an experiment. We tried to do, we had some money from Knowledge Exchange Research England, and we tried to do a short course in the community, getting practitioners to learn about socially engaged practice. and it was quite successful, but we found it difficult to sustain it. So, you know, look, I don't know if, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but, you know, if NCAD has any ideas about some kind of training course, a short training course that people could do that wouldn't be too onerous on time, but would, you know, perhaps kickstart people who have an interest in working in this area. There might be, I suppose what people do as well is they do the PG cert into post-compulsory education, but that isn't a specialist route, it's a general route. Perhaps this is something that we need to work on, thinking about how we professionalise the sector.
Brilliant. Yeah, completely resonate with that as well, because I done a postgraduate qualification in teaching, but it was not specialist. So I had to draw from my art education when I got into the art classroom in adult community learning.
Yeah.
So Lisa asks, obviously, first, thank you for your presentation. Lots of love in the chat.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
So the benefits of adult education in the arts are not measured. Is this true, as I've tried to write about it in my postgrad and couldn't find any sources? Do you know if there's any ongoing research to remedy this?
It depends. It's a very difficult question, this, because it depends what you are measuring and what you value. So there might be studies talking about, for instance, how arts education leads to work in the creative industries, and that would be seen as valuable and of value, and it is. I'm not saying it isn't, but I suppose I was talking about the things that Gert Biester would say are difficult to measure. So the impact on an individual's well-being, for example, or the way that somebody can engage politically or on a community level, those kind of attributes. There was the study, Thomas and Malloy, that I mentioned in the presentation, that might be worth looking at. But yeah, that, I suppose what my answer is, it depends what you're measuring, and you know, some things are easier to measure than others.
Brilliant, thank you. And Michelle has popped something very intriguing in the chat, saying that you're in the process of developing a training offer.
Ooh,
so all lies
wow,
this
that's
way.
really good. That's really good.
Offers to share resources as well from Susan and Penny. I hope I have not missed any questions in the chat. If I have, if you've asked one and I've missed it, there's been a lot of activity in there, so perhaps repost it so I can see it easily. But I did have one of my own questions actually for you, Sam. I know we've talked at length in the run up to this, but I don't think I've actually ever asked you. You touched on the thing of students being inspired by their artist teachers to become artist teachers. Was that the same for you? Is there anyone in your educational journey who you particularly draw upon?
Oh gosh, my art teacher. I did O levels. I'm very old. My O level art teacher, Miss Firth. I suspect she won't be with us anymore, but she was a very inspirational character. And then when I went and did my degree, Karen Lyons, wonderful artist, a drawer. She went on to manage the art and design at Salford University. I think she's retired now. She was an amazing educator. She just seemed to listen. Both of these people listened and were reflective. And when they spoke to you, they didn't speak to you quickly. They would listen to you, think, and then come back and then talk to you. And it was that measured approach seemed to work very well with me. And then I must talk about somebody who wasn't an artist and wasn't a teacher, a lady called Kate Gimlett, who was a community, she worked for the council, and she ran community and voluntary service for the local council. and she gave me lots of opportunities to work in community centres, in youth groups. She employed me to work with festivals. I think she believed in me, basically. And those three people, were incredibly inspiring to me at that moment in time.
Brilliant. I love stories, so I like hearing people's backgrounds and where they've come from. Let me see. I've just had a message in from Kirsty. I wonder how Ilkley Art School fund themselves, and can it be replicated? Like you say, it needs to be consistent and open to all. Well,
they do charge, but not lots of money. It's not exorbitant, but they do have to charge. But they run it with a lot of their goodwill, a lot of their belief in the power of art and the need for people to access the arts. They, I think last time I spoke to them, they were trying to think about going to the next level. And you see that the issue is, the minute you get funding, you are beholden to that funder. So your independence, and you have to have the values of the funder, basically. So it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one. Sometimes, and I've seen this, not necessarily in the arts, but people get together, they have a community intervention, it's really successful. The local council funds it and it's brilliant. But then when the council's funding goes away, they've got cuts, then that group falls apart, and you just wonder, would they have been better off staying independent? I mean, obviously that's a big question. It's a complex thing, funding. It really is.
Yes, definitely. And I think we saw that link when we were just even thinking about the local authority delivery centres with their all of their own funding streams. So that's why it's so inconsistent across the country. And again, with prison, I imagine very different in different prisons.
Yeah.
We have another question, possibly our last for this section, from Penny, saying, is there a potential link here with the Saturday Art Club? Saturday Art Club.
I don't know much about the Saturday Art Club, but I suspect probably yes, because Saturdays might be time and space for adults who are not working on the weekend or don't have care responsibilities. Perhaps the weekends are a good time and space for adults to learn, or to learn skills, or to just engage with the arts. And I think it's great that we perhaps need to think about different times and spaces, and perhaps some of those times and spaces are asynchronous, online learning, distance learning, because the adult sector is so diverse and people's needs are so diverse. Then I think perhaps the opportunities to learn need to be varied as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing with us this morning in your keynote and in answering all of those questions so eloquently. There is so much knowledge coming out in the chat as well. So people, please do scroll through there. You may find some interesting links or other leads that you want to follow up after the conference today. So coming up next, we have some parallel sessions where we will introduce the first of our presenters, but we are going to take a comfort break before we get started with that. So if we come back at 11 a.m, we will be ready to jump into those parallel sessions and meet some of our artist teachers and adult community learning. Thank you for joining us so far, and we'll see you again in about 11 minutes.